Hi, it's Mark Coopersmith from UC Berkeley in my ongoing series of conversations with innovators, entrepreneurs, investors, social entrepreneurs. And today I'm really pleased to be spending some time with Lennaert Jonkers. Lennaert, welcome to my video series.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Great to be here.
Great. And right now I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we are catching you where?
I'm currently based out of Budapest.
So out of Budapest, and you're originally Dutch, is that right? And our paths crossed when we were collaborating some around opportunities in Vienna, where I've spent a reasonable amount of time and worked with the Austrian government, and you have too. But right now we're in different parts of the world as we're all locked down under COVID. So fascinating.
Yeah.
So, all right. So what we'd like to talk about today, as Lennaert and I were kind of preparing what we were going to cover, is two key areas: entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, and the integration of both of those and what it means to be sustainable in that context. And then a little bit at the end, we want to talk about an area where Lennaert pays a particular focus, which is around path to commercialization. When you have emerging technologies or new opportunities, what's that path to commercialization look like? So we hope to cover that in the next several 20 minutes or so. So Lennaert, first of all, if you would, can you share just a little bit about yourself, kind of where you focus, what you do, the institutes you work with, how you teach, those types of things?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I'm very blessed to support people, entrepreneurs in various ways. So some of it is helping them finding the right investors and vice versa. So working with some direct investment family offices. Next to that, I'm also involved with a couple of European initiatives around urban mobility, food, and agri-tech, working with making investments and helping them on investing in new technologies, as well as improving their programs and making sure that there's more impact being made with all the tax money being spent on it, right? So that's a big part. Next to that, I'm also an entrepreneur myself. So I did not study, I worked, and by that I studied. And yeah, helping a lot of people commercialize their innovation to make impact through business, but ultimately creating new sustainable businesses.
Yeah, that's one of the areas where you and I definitely overlap. While we both teach and coach and run programs, we've each been entrepreneurs and are entrepreneurial in our approach towards driving businesses, advising businesses, launching them, all of that. So hopefully the conversations that you all that are watching this benefit from are firmly attached to some of the realities of the world, in addition to providing some of the frameworks that we try and use to help kind of simplify and define this. Lennaert, one of the things that you talked about is there's kind of a duality in your approach. You work with large family offices. They're looking for an ROI, right? A return on their investment. They're not just investing to benefit society, but they're also looking on, this is an abbreviation, an acronym we just coined, an RTS, a return to society, as well as their ROI. Are those two explicitly competing objectives, generating revenue and providing societal or social or environmental benefits?
I think coming from kind of the industrialization part, I think that's where they would be kind of split in two, whereas now I see that they're converging. So, and especially in case of family offices who do direct investments, they have patient capital. They do not have a 10-year term on their fund like VCs have. They do not have shareholders in the way that corporates have. So they have a lot more flexibility to look further and to also take different types of projects to market and benefits from those.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting, you may have some more information than I do, is some of the studies that I've seen about family offices that have exactly that long-term time frame, that long-term horizon, shows that the businesses that they build and that they invest in are far more durable, because they don't suffer from those short-term pressures, either to grow quickly so they can get an exit or to provide those quarterly results. Family offices, typically not publicly traded, they can balance their mission and vision as key members of society with the desire to both retain and grow their financial capabilities. So I don't know if you have more thoughts on that or if you've seen some of those same studies.
Yeah, I think there are two things there. The one is just being informed about what's happening now in the world, where it's just, you know, basic sense to invest in something that on a long term is sustainable on multiple axes, whereas they were always family offices and family businesses as well. So if you talk anything family and anything multi-generation, is long-term vision, which
Right.
is, if you look at the East, China, and other countries, they have much more long-term strategies. So the sustainability part is already taken in. So I think that's why they're already kind of earlier at picking up this kind of ESG and this type of things, which are now kind of a new thing. But I think for these guys, they were already much longer on that track.
Yeah, so in the teaching and the advising that I do, it's a lot of it is very Silicon Valley. Let's, focus on key big markets, get big quick, create huge value, right? We all still look to be those unicorns. So there's that element, but I also teach social entrepreneurship, and take very much a Silicon Valley approach to that. So you and I have just started to touch on the fact that they're not mutually exclusive to try and generate capital, to try and generate that return on investment while also providing societal good. You can do well while also doing good. So let's talk about a few examples around that, because I want to demystify the fact that, it's bad to make money because, on that. So is there an example or two that, you might have, or I'm happy to lead off with an example too?
Yeah, I mean, the first things that come to mind then is really that there's this change in overall collective mindset and perspective on this. So what was kind of fluffy and kind of nice to have or wishful thinking is now becoming considered by corporates who have a really down the line approach because they have shareholders. And one example that comes to mind is where in Ukraine they were working on something called phages, which is a natural bio solution actually to any bacterial infection. So, and it's anywhere where there are people, where there are these bacteria, there are bacteriophages. It just, then there's a specific process to extract them and make them usable for people. But when I was talking in the past to someone who was looking to commercialize it, he didn't want to do it. Fast forward 2 years ago, and that was 15 years ago. Fast forward 2 years ago.
And that part of that is because these are naturally occurring, right? So they may not explicitly be protectable when you talk about that IP protection, et cetera.
That was the issue. So it was not patentable. And because of that, there was no business case to exit from, right? So investors were not really that juicy on that. And nowadays, there was a Polish company who was using it actually for animals to help them, because for humans, it's still a bit of a taboo on one hand, and also there's some issues with quality and how to fit that into the whole medical certification and so on. So that's still a challenge.
And are the phage technologies used kind of as opposed to, you mentioned that it's antibacterial as opposed to antibiotics, and we know there's huge issues with regard to use of antibiotics in animals, especially in farm animals.
Yeah, so the great thing, and I mean, if you look from a social perspective, also in third world countries and so on, wherever there is this superbug, so superbacteria or new bacteria, there will be phages that will consume those. So the solution is actually already there everywhere, but it's just not being utilized and commercialized at this point.
It's one of our natural responses, right? Mother Nature gets it right more often than not. And it's when we mess with Mother Nature that we run into problems, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and we know, of course, that so many of the bacteria that we see out there have become increasingly antibiotic resistant. So there will eventually need to be treatments that aren't traditional antibiotics. And is that going to then potentially come back over into human applications?
Well, exactly. I mean, in Ukraine, the example, what I started with, that was a hospital who had these superbugs, and they didn't have money for antibiotics, so they started to a different route with these phages, and basically solve the problem like that.
Right.
But fast forward, I think if you look to the future, where there wasn't a business model in the past, there's going to be a business model as soon as there's no other viable solution anymore.
Right.
Right. What is kind of social before becomes really an asset which you can commercialize.
Well,
And
and what's fascinating about that is if you think about this as we go forward, first of all, science advances, so we gain a better understanding of some of these natural reactions, like with phages that you're talking about. Also, the world evolves, so many of these strains of infections will become increasingly resistant to man-made approaches, which is where some of the natural approaches may make sense. And hopefully, the underlying economics of naturally occurring combatants like phages may also reduce the cost of treatment over the long run, especially for broad applications.
exactly. Oh,
Yeah.
that's very.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see how that comes together. You were sharing something. Let me offer up an example that one of my students a few years ago came up with, which I thought was really fascinating. This was in a social entrepreneurship course, and they had done a lot of work in the slums of Manila in the Philippines. And one of the huge issues there is what to deal with human waste. There's just open sewers of human waste. There is not indoor plumbing in many instances, things like that. And they wanted to create porta potties throughout the slums of Manila. But the challenge with that, of course, is there's a big cost associated, not just with installing those, but then in continuing to service those. So what started out as explicitly a social venture became one of looking at the business model around human waste. And if you at least started with, say, a grant to put the porta potties in place, then you need a group of individuals that would clean those out and maintain them. But then what to do with the waste? Well, it turns out that human waste can be used as a very nutritious food for raising farmed fish. And then all of a sudden you start to create this virtuous cycle where something that was worthless and actually you had to pay to take away had value. So you could pay people to clean out and maintain the toilets. Then the people who did that could turn around and sell the human waste to fish farmers who could use it in lieu of more extensive feedstock. Of course, there were issues they needed to make sure around sanitation. And then, but it allowed them, if they were with less expensive food stock, to raise their fish for less. That then created less expensive fresh fish for the inhabitants of the slums of Manila. So if you think about business models and saying, how can each of our individuals make a little bit of money, you create this virtuous cycle that becomes fundamentally sustainable, and they don't need to keep coming back for funding every year to manage this. So I think it's putting that entrepreneur's head on it and saying, where's the value created? And I'm sure you have some other examples, or maybe that resonates with some of the things that you've seen as well.
Well, exactly. Another way to look at it, just as a base, is, creating something that has value. You need to exchange it for something. Well,
Right.
we use a system to do that. I mean, you can also do it in kind, in goods. Bitcoins, I mean, it's evolving all the time, but there is always an exchange. And I think that's the basic thing of doing business, is knowing how to create value, how to add value more so you can create more value and get a better return. I mean, so there's nothing bad about that, as you said. And I think, yeah, it's the operating system now of the world. It might change. That's really possible in the future. But for now, this is the way to put things into the world most effectively. This is the context in which we are currently living. So I think that's good to embrace. And one of the things, again, I'm coming back to this mindset where, you mentioned this waste example, which can be turned into nutrients. In Amsterdam, they also had in the harbor some industries that produced heat and other that produced and needed heat, and vice versa. They had water which they could cool with. So they had a service system that was cooled by the water, and the excess heat was used to heat the water for other appliances. So it's there. It's just how you're going to use that effectively. So that's a very kind of smart example. But another one, which is something kind of controversial, is where if you look at the world's energy consumption, it's only going higher, and it's going
Right.
higher actually everywhere, right? Even in third world countries and developing countries. When you look at nuclear, most people would say, oh, in terms of sustainability, that's the worst thing you can do. It's evil, garlic and silver bullets, get away
Right.
from it,
Right.
right? But actually, it's probably one of the most feasible technologies which you can use, which is a molten salt reactor, which is different type of reactor than previously used. It's not fission, but fusion. So it's
Right.
actually safe by physics and not safe by engineering. So it's very useful, but still there's just this bias that it's bad. Well, actually, that's the only thing that could be used to replace coal, which is really adding to our climate issues that we're seeing now. I mean, we just started off talking before with the forest fires. I mean,
Right.
so it's funny
Exactly.
how are just also a matter of perception, right? How you view it.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, nuclear is fascinating in that, it's a non-carbon producing source of energy, which, and carbon has become such a huge issue, as we look at the overall climate debate, and also as we look at the environment, that we say are the risks from from bringing on, as we look especially at developing countries, all these new carbon producing power plants, is that greater than new emerging much safer technologies around nuclear? In the past, we didn't really care about carbon, so that wasn't part of the, or at least most societies didn't when we think back 20, 30, 50 years. And we didn't really have some of the safety elements or understand nuclear energy nearly as well. So the technology has advanced, and the entire backdrop of the challenges the world is facing have fundamentally changed. So it's funny how something like nuclear can be rehabilitated. And while certainly still controversial from the standpoint of many environmentalists, it's a less worse choice, a less bad choice than it used to be anyway. So
Right.
fascinating how that changes. Yeah, thanks for raising that. Uh, we could keep going, but there's a second topic I want to talk about that you and I were chatting about before we push the record button, and that is an area that you do a lot of work on around path to commercialization.
Yeah.
And first of all, I'd like to ask you to differentiate path to commercialization from growth and growth hacking, which is also, one of these things everybody wants to understand, and some of these other elements around marketing, branding, et cetera. When you talk about path to commercialization, what does that mean?
So yeah, 2 years ago, I was coming across a guy named Uday Fatka, and he was talking about a systemic way to scale and commercialize ideas, technology, or grow businesses. And that kind of struck a chord with me, because while I was mentoring, I mean, I think by now over 1,000 companies I've mentored in person in the last years, what I always saw was, great, all these design sprints, ideation, hackathons. Okay, then you have a business model canvas, then you start to validate. That's something that often still doesn't happen good, but that's an whole other conversation. But once you have this rough business model or idea validated, then to put that into a business, okay, maybe people get some seed money and they have a team together, so they start a company. But then, do you have actually your market validated? Do you understand your market space? Those are two different things that usually people don't even know what is the
Right.
difference. And another part is, do you have a systemic way to approach it? Do you know, if I talk in the language of Uday, which levers to pull, right?
Right.
So he was looking at, okay, what factors actually matter? And I think that that's something of a black box, and is least understood, because it's like you have the startups, and then you have scale ups, and then we have these unicorns, these mythical creatures, which is a question if they exist or not, but that's also another thing. But to have a systemic way to actually commercialize your innovation or technology or products, that's something that is rarely understood. And there's a big gap between those that kind of make it somehow and those that start off very enthusiastically with a bag of money. And I mean, 94% of companies just doesn't get past the second chasm, or
Right,
so
right.
they don't have a way to have they have a business model, but not a scalable business model,
Well,
right?
yeah, so I think getting to that scalable business model is huge. So if I can channel a little bit, or let me make sure I'm framing it correctly. When we talk about that path to commercialization, if you're dealing with a new technology or an emerging technology, or if you're addressing a new or emerging market need, and the world is changing so quickly that we know there's a lot of both of those, then the road hasn't yet been paved in many instances on how to get from here to there, on how to get from a promising new technology or solution to broader adoption in the marketplace. It's not about marketing it yet. It's actually making sure that you can create it, that people know how to use it, that you can protect the intellectual property if that's involved, so that there is a return on investment that enables you to continue to reinvest. Oftentimes there's an education that needs to take place if it's a new solution. We were just talking about new and emerging types, for example, of nuclear energy, right?
Yeah.
There may need to be a rethinking and kind of a shifting in people's mindset about what nuclear energy is before it becomes acceptable. So the path to commercialization around some of that new emerging nuclear technology that you were discussing is pretty significant. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I'll bring in something from my standpoint that's really important. And you can see a poster over my shoulder for the other F word, right? How we put failure to work. There's a lot of small experiments that take place on that path to commercialization. Some work, some don't, but there is some iteration and trial and error that you have to build into that process from all the work that I've done on that. And I see you nodding. So I hope that that kind of resonates. And it's part of the game plan you put in place to move from promising and emerging to solving a big problem for a lot of stakeholders. And please, fill in the gaps or go from there.
No, I think you're touching on very relevant point. And I think, for example, I'm now based in Budapest. And one of the big challenges for entrepreneurs here locally is they have great ideas. That the world is full with ideas, so that's not a problem. But then it's very difficult here to actually make mistakes because it's not in the culture to make
Right.
mistakes. In school, so in education, there is the way that you have to be right and not be wrong, right? The answer is false or true. And these are kind of conceptions which, okay, I always say validate. Is is the data showing one thing or the other? And even if somebody says it's not true, how many times people were proven wrong? And I mean, the biggest discoveries were always the people that are proving a lot of people wrong often in the space.
Right.
So that's one. And the second thing is that when you see those innovators really tackling these big problems for these big audiences, they're often not the people who are from that field. They're often outside people who have another perspective, probably who most investors would say, what is your track record in banking? I mean, if you look at fintech banks, right, there's a lot of buzz, and there's also a lot of boom going on right now, with especially the European fintech, the neobanks. But really, most of them were not from the banking industry who founded that, because they have a different view on it. And I think that's super helpful. But again, once you have that view, once you have that idea, how do you commercialize it? What capabilities do you need? And I think that step from going from a team to a company, that transition usually doesn't really happen well. And that's on the human side. It's on culture. It's diversity is now something being taught about a lot. There's all these elements that come back there.
Yeah. Last question for you. So I'm beaming to you from San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, right? Kind of the granddaddy of the entrepreneurial ecosystems, kind of where it started. You're coming from from Europe, and you've spent time kind of across Europe as we take a look, whether you're in Hungary or in Austria or in the Netherlands or elsewhere where you've taught in the family offices. If you take a look at differences between the kind of Silicon Valley approach to this entrepreneurship and the integration with social entrepreneurship, environmental causes, and the European perspective, how might you parse those, or how might you compare them? Are they all that different? Are they moving together? Is this element of entrepreneurship versus social entrepreneurship blurring? Kind of give us some thoughts with a little bit of that European global perspective to kind of help us close this out.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting when you look at all these different areas. You have a United States, we have Europe, which is a group of companies, and you have a United States. I mean, the word says it, right? We don't have United European States.
Right.
And there lies the problem. I mean, how many language do they have? How many tax systems do we have? So
right.
Have that runway to this, or this access to this big market that you have locally in the US, so it's your backyard, you can experience it. That's a lot less in Europe. We do have a lot of human capital, a lot of well-educated people, so there's also a lot of value. But in the end, what you see is things need to scale, and that's something that's very hard. Especially if I would say in Holland, when you would ask for $1 million, they would say, how much can you do with $500,000?
Right.
And in America, they would say, well, what would happen if I give you 3 million? So
right.
Is this different and this bigger picture thinking? And I mean, in the end, on my LinkedIn page, it said the future is visual, which all I'm saying is, you have to imagine it to go somewhere new or somewhere unfamiliar or something inspiring, because it's not going to be something that's very logical, very, you won't make the leap then. And I think Americans generally think bigger, and I think Europeans generally do not, because it's very localized, because of culture, because of a lot of strengths, which sometimes when you want to scale, when you want to commercialize, are working actually against you in some ways, if you're not aware.
Well, sometimes I think we move a little bit too quickly with a little bit too much money, right? So that's why we have some famous flameouts. But you're right, we do have that. And I know for many of my European companies, students, colleagues, despite the European Union, they very much think about their growth arc country by country, not pan-European or pan-Western European or whatever. It's like, no, we're going to start in France, or we're going to start in Germany, and then we're going to move in. And they really plot that out kind of piece by piece. So whereas in the US, yes, you might start regionally, but then you're going to grow very quickly. That's a great way to close. Lennaert, thank you for joining today and sharing some thoughts. It's also always great to get a global perspective on the topics of entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, the way different societies address it. It was my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.